for I'm sorry.
Recording in progress.
Oh, okay. Thanks to Dan for taking the class last week. Michelle and Matt and I were in St. Louis visiting with some relatives we hadn't seen for quite some time. And we tuned into the church down there. So we missed you, but we're glad to be back here. Okay, thank you. Last week, Dan says we were in Acts chapter 24, where Paul, after his arrest in Jerusalem, or after being detained in Jerusalem, was in a sense on trial before this Roman procurator named Felix. And how'd that end up? Did he get a decision?
No.
No. Felix was like some officials that we've heard of, was looking for a handout. So he kept calling Paul back and talking to him. And so just 2 years go by. And so nothing is done. And finally, Felix is recalled to Rome, and we have a new Roman procurator named Festus. But in talking to this procurator named Felix, what was Paul's message? We'll just do that as review of last week's lesson. What do you talk to a Roman procurator about? It always impressed me.
In verse 25 of chapter 20, it says, Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come.
Yeah. So he's not just using the time to plead his own cause and to convince Felix that he's innocent and should be freed. He uses it as an opportunity to, in essence, preach a sermon and to talk about some factors that might be of use to Felix. Felix was a Roman procurator that was not the most honest man in the world. And as we said, eventually he's recalled to Rome for failure to keep the province there under control. There have been some complaints about his treatment of prisoners and complaints about the fact that there were some riots and dissatisfaction with him. And eventually he doesn't return. But anyway, but does that serve as any kind of an example for us in what we should say when we're talking to people about Jesus? Or is this just unique to Paul and Felix?
It's a little of both, I think. I mean, we should talk about the hope of the resurrection, and we should talk about self-control and righteousness. But you look at what Paul talked to Felix about, and then you look at Felix's person. He was expecting a bride. Therefore, he probably knew he wasn't a righteous man. Felix probably knew himself he wasn't a righteous man. Talked about self-control. Well, why did Felix need a bride? Felix probably owed money to somebody. And again, talking about self-control, Felix is a Roman. The Romans were about stoic self-control. And so Paul, all things to all people, he was attempting to show the following Christ can be done by a Roman who's raised as a Stoic or a spiritual Jew or a
So in talking about Christ, that's an essential part of the message, isn't it? That if we follow Christ, it involves a change in our life. And it involves a recognition that there is going to be a judgment. There's going to be a time of reckoning. And so, again, as I mentioned on numerous occasions, to talk about the judgment has been described by someone as the heavy artillery of the gospel. And it's something that you're not going to win the war, if you will, without using your heavy artillery and mentioning that there's going to be a day of reckoning and we need to be prepared for that.
And it had an effect on Felix, and it made him afraid.
Yeah.
And he actually then sent Paul away because maybe it was having maybe too deep an effect on him, and he maybe didn't want to change, but this was kind of making him think about it too much.
It also, I think, is interesting who else was in the audience when he talks about these things, about righteousness and self-control. Felix's wife.
Right? Yeah.
Felix may have been not just afraid that Felix was mean, but suddenly she's hearing these things and looking at her husband saying, you're not, here this man you got in prison, and you're not following, you're not a righteous man, you're not a just man, you're not a man of self-control. Last thing Felix wants is an unhappy wife within the household.
Right. Well, and Drusilla is a Herod, and so there's a lot of intermarriage here. She's actually the sister of Agrippa, who we're going to meet in the next chapter, and of course his sister Bernice, and all three of those are children of Herod, who we found earlier in the book of Acts, who got eaten by worms and who was responsible for murdering James, the brother of John. So there's a lot of intermarriage and so on going on here. But that's a good point. The morals is something that needs to be talked about in that society as well as our society. So Paul has a lot of courage to do that. But as we say, Felix was recalled. He was replaced by a man named Festus. Porcius Festus is his name. And so he's actually a more just man than Felix was. He's an older man. He's going to die after just about 2 years in office here in Palestine. But we meet him briefly in this chapter 25. So 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, and that's where the Jewish leaders are. Normally the Roman procurator stays in Caesarea, up north and west of Jerusalem on the coast there. And anyway, the chief priests and Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. Remember, this has been how long? 2 years Paul has been kept. But these people are still out to get him. And so maybe, I don't know if there's a lesson there. Satan doesn't give up. Satan doesn't give up. These people are just about as anxious to deal with Paul because they view him as a traitor and just have it in for him. They urgently requested Festus as a favor to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Remember earlier, they were going to try to ambush him before he was sent to Caesarea for protection. Now they want him on the road back. But Festus, Paul is being held at Caesarea. He seems to see through these plots. And I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me and press charges against the man there if he has done anything wrong. So he's a man with some wisdom. And after spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea the next day and he convened the court in order that Paul be brought before him. When Paul appeared, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. So that's kind of typical of what's been preferred against Paul and earlier against Jesus. Then Paul made his defense against Festus. I have done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews and or against the temple or against Caesar. That's what he's been accused of previously. They saw him with some Gentiles in the city and presumed that he had brought him in the temple in violation of the law. He'd gone out of his way to keep the Nazirite vow, just to show that he had not urged the Jews to abandon the law. And Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, he's a politician, and so he'd like to be in the good graces of the Jewish leaders, but he knows Paul also is a Roman citizen. Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I'm guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar, which is kind of a big deal because Roman citizens had the right to have their cases reviewed by the emperor himself. And of course, to do that, you had to travel to Rome, where the emperor was. And you kind of know there's a system designed to have some fairness and some right of appeal, which we're familiar with. But in knowing the Roman emperors, you took your chances when you appeared before one of these guys, because you never know what they were going to do. Some of those guys did some extreme things to their friends, out of jealousy. And so anyway, but Paul felt that he had to do this to avoid eventually being actually murdered by the Jewish leaders. So he appeals to Caesar and has a right to go to Rome. Remember, the Lord had said, I'll be with you and you testify for me in Rome. And Paul, perhaps assumed it'd be a nice missionary journey to Rome. He didn't perhaps foresee that the Lord would get him there in chains, actually. And so the Lord uses us sometimes in unusual ways. And that's the story of Paul. Interesting how, as we go along, how does Luke know all of this? It's interesting. We're almost given, the fly on the wall insight. He knows what the Jewish leaders are doing, and could read the mind of Festus here. Must have been some of those Jewish leaders, perhaps members of the Sanhedrin that Luke was able to talk to in putting together his account of the Acts of the Apostles. Maybe even some people that were from, associated with the Roman side of things. But it's interesting, as we step back, how do we get to know? The Lord could reveal this to Luke, but probably he's talking to different people from different vantage points. Anyway, after Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. So that's how we get to think about Paul's journey to Rome. And if you have the Bible with the maps in the back, you have the first missionary journey, the second, the third missionary journey, and then the fourth one. The fourth missionary journey is always described as the journey to Rome. And we'll get to that in a couple of chapters because it's one of the most detailed descriptions of sea travel in that time. But before that, Festus is in a little bit of a bind because he's got a defendant who's appealing, but there's been no decision against him. He has written nothing to appeal. And so Festus, he doesn't know what to say. He's supposed to write up what the charges were and what the decision was so that the Caesar and his advisors can review that. But Festus really has nothing to say. So he's looking around to find what is he going to write to Caesar. And so he finds, well, maybe I can, something will come out if Paul appears before Agrippa. King Agrippa. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus as the Roman procurator. Agrippa is the son. His name is really Herod Agrippa, and we would know him as Herod Agrippa II. Herod Agrippa I was the guy we met earlier in Acts as the Herod who was, like we said, eaten by worms because of pride. Remember that description we read from Josephus. Even before that, though, he was the one who put James to death, arrested Peter, and Peter was miraculously. So he's the this guy here, Herod Agrippa II, is the great-grandson of Herod, so-called Herod the Great, who was around when Jesus was born. And this guy is the grandson of the Herod who's in office and before whom Jesus appeared in his own trial. Pilate said, well, send me to Herod since he's from Galilee. That was the grandfather of this guy. So the Herod family is a fascinating family, including Herod Agrippa. And he doesn't have a wife, but he travels with his sister and spent so much time with her that caused a little bit of a scandal at the time. What's going on there? And of course, again, his other sister is Drusilla, married to Phoebe. Anyway, there's a lot of intermarriage and things like that going on. But so Paul has to appear before this Agrippa. He was raised in Rome and finally given some territory in the Palestine area, and was so obsequious toward the emperor that his kingdom grew. So he's in control, king of a part of Palestine that we would call modern day Lebanon, and that's been expanded a little bit south. So anyway, he's there. And so as is always the case with the Herod family, they congratulated themselves on being close to the Jewish people, remember? And so Agrippa, he's supposed to be well-versed in the Jewish law, even though he's not really a Jew. The Herod family comes from the Idumeans, or the descendants of Esau. So, but anyway, so Paul, since they're spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, there's a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told him that it is not the Roman custom to hand over any man before he has faced his accusers and has had an opportunity to defend himself against their charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I expected. What would those be? Insurrection against Rome, the challenge to the Caesar. When Festus shows up, there is some insurrection going on. There's somebody leads a group of rebels out into the wilderness. Festus deals with that and kills them all. So he's not, any kind of a passive man. He's willing to uphold Roman authority. But anyway, he's not accused by that. When his accusers got up to speak, instead they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion, you know, the temple observance and that stuff. And about a dead man named Jesus who Paul claimed was alive. So Festus doesn't know much about Jesus. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he'd be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there. No. When Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. Tomorrow you will hear him. So this is going to be Paul's opportunity to appear before a king. Remember, the Lord has told him you're going to appear before the Gentiles, kings. So here's a king. He's not the biggest king in the world. He's a sub-king of the Caesar, but he is a king. And so the next day, any comments or thoughts? Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking officers and leading men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man? The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found he has done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. That sounds a little strange to those, you know, again, it's like in the case of Jesus. Pilate knows Jesus is innocent, but he won't release him. Instead, he is and flogged and eventually ends up condemning him to death. Festus, he's smart enough to know that Paul is innocent of charges against the Roman Empire, but he won't let him go because, again, he's caught with these Jewish people. He's afraid to antagonize them too much because they can make complaints to Rome. And maybe he'd get recalled, and you never know what the emperor might do. But so he doesn't have the courage of his conviction. Herod Agrippa, of course, while they were, you know, friends, or Herod Agrippa would like nothing more than to have his kingdom expanded to include the portion of the place that's under the Roman procurator, which his grandfather and great-grandfather, his great-grandfather, was ruler of the whole area, Herod the Great. Anyway, so they're all out after themselves. But I have nothing definite to write to His Majesty about it. What can he say? King Agrippa, so that I brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send on a prisoner without specifying the charges against him. So anyway, to show you a little bit about Roman law, it illustrates the personalities which Paul is dealing with, and just kind of a corrupt situation. But yeah.
Have things changed today?
Yeah, that's
I pointed that out in the lesson last week.
Yeah.
We have maybe 3 aldermen heading for prison right now in our city. Because of, you know, looking for a handout, and then they graphs and all this stuff, and there are going to be more because there's a federal investigation going on of our city government. So things haven't changed in 21 centuries.
Yeah. So, but Paul just has to be forthright, which he is. So here's Paul's opportunity to talk to a king. And so as we go into the next chapter, that'll be the question. What do you say when you are talking to a king? A Herod king. A Herod who has been responsible for so much. The family has been responsible for so much death and destruction. Agrippa said to Paul, you have permission to speak for yourself. Yeah, comment. Okay. So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusation of the Jews, and especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. A little bit of compliment doesn't hurt. Remember, that's how they both started in talking to Felix. A wise, you've been around for a long time, Felix. I couldn't say that the best as he wasn't around very long, but anyway. So he's able to talk to, Festus doesn't know Jesus. He's never heard of it, some guy. Agrippa knows about the way Paul is going to say. He talks about the church and describes it as the way. The Jews all know the way I have lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country, Tarsus, and also in Jerusalem. They have known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing, that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived as a Pharisee. And now it is because of my hope in what God has promised our fathers that I am on trial today. What is that hope?
What's the resurrection? We talked about that.
Resurrection, but specifically the Messiah. The Messiah. And we, this along with other passages, we read the Old Testament, and yes, we say, oh, here's a passage about the Messiah. And here's another passage, and Isaiah has some passages about the Messiah, and we'll refer to them as we go along in this chapter. But sometimes we fail to appreciate the extent to which that concept of a Messiah was with the Jews in their lives every day. There was that expectation that God was going to do something for them. And it wasn't something that they read once in a while. It was with them all the time. So that's what Paul is talking about. That's why there were so many, or that's why there were a lot of uprisings against the Roman government, people claiming that they were the Messiah. Festus hasn't run into one of those in the short time that he's been procurator. And some guy led a bunch of people out in the wilderness, you know. So Paul is talking about, this is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. The concept of the Messiah is especially strong in their hearts as they languish under Roman rule. You know, that's they focus on that more. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? So that's, Dan mentioned, that's one of the aspects of this resurrection. Where do we read about that? Well, Psalm 16, thou shalt not suffer thy Holy One to see corruption. They expected it, but it's an interesting statement. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? What would your answer be if someone asked you that question today? Because you go out on the streets and most people, you know, would most people say it's incredible that God raises the dead? I think a lot of people would, don't you?
Yeah.
Man, it's crazy. This was a time when there was more of a belief in spirits and things like that. Angels, of course, the Pharisees believed in those things. So I don't know. You think it's a tougher situation today when people don't believe that God raises the dead? How do you deal with that?
Well, I think we take it on faith, because none of us have ever actually witnessed someone being raised from the dead. I mean, people in Jesus' time, there were some people who had actually witnessed someone being raised from the dead. If they were there when Lazarus was raised. So there would have been people who could actually say that, but in our time, we have to take it on faith.
Paul deals with that in a sense. We looked at earlier in the book of Acts. He's going to build to that because he first talks about God as creator. Remember, into the Athenians, there's a God. He created all of this. Once people have that, or at least that's one way to approach it, isn't it? That there's a creator. Look around you. Things are not here by accident. If there is a God, if there is a creator of the world, then things are so complex and wonderful that there is no limit to what he can do. And so it is not incredible that that God, who could create people, could raise people from the dead. So maybe we could have to build in that way. I don't know. It just seems like it's a hurdle to just go out there and say, we represent a guy who was raised from the dead. People are going, wait a minute. I never saw anybody raised from the dead.
Maybe it's easier for us to accept that. Most have been raised in the church. Been hearing about that since kindergarten. Jesus rose from the dead, so we just kind of accept that. But not everybody's been raised in the church, and they haven't heard that.
So it's kind of a hurdle that you have to get over.
It sounds incredible, but we forget about all the other stuff we accept out of faith that we didn't actually see either.
Yeah.
We didn't see the Civil War happen. I mean, we can find uniform scraps of old bullets and stuff, but we accept the whole chronology of the armies moving around just based on what people wrote and said.
Yeah.
It's not much more of a stretch than this.
And that's right. There's more, stronger evidence in the Gospels, which we kind of take for granted that Jesus was raised from the dead than there is for most of the other historical events of that time. So anyway, it's just something to think about. I too was convinced that I ought to do all that was possible to oppose the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And that is just what I did in Jerusalem. On the authority of the chief priests, I put many of the saints in prison. And when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. So one of these really comes out that I was responsible for the death of Christians. Many a time I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished. And I tried to force them to blaspheme, to deny Jesus. In my obsession against them, I even went to foreign cities to persecute them. So again, this is the second time now we read across in Acts chapter 22, when Paul is going to talk about his conversion, because we read about it in Acts chapter 29, Acts 22, and Acts 26, 3 parallel passages on the conversion of Saul of Tarsus. On one of these journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. About noon, O king, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. That's something that we read here. What does that mean? Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads.
He knows the story of Jesus, and it seems like, you know, he's sort of believing it, and it's kind of poking at it, keeps poking. That's what a goad was, something that they would use to make cattle go in a certain direction. And but it was so counter to what he had always believed that he just, it seemed like it made him fight all the harder to not believe it.
Did you ever see a goad? Just a sharp stick that's used to push cattle along. When I first started working, I worked for Swift and Company, the meat packers, and I had the opportunity on several occasions to have a tour of a slaughterhouse that called more elegantly a beef or pork packing plant. And you got to see the animals go up the chute to the place of their demise. And they literally had people there with sharp sticks to keep them moving along, because they could sense that this was not a desirable place to go. But anyway, Paul's point is the goads of life are pushing us to do God's will. And if we're acting against God's will, we're in effect going back against those sharp sticks, and we're getting into situations which are painful and difficult. We don't, we don't tend to view life like that, but it's true. God is urging us in many ways in the right way. How does he do that? What are the goads? Do you have any of it?
Well, his word is kind of a goad.
Yeah.
I mean, it pushes us along.
Yeah.
If we really read it and take it seriously, it's just pushing us in the direction of Christ, in a different way. But other Christians can do that too in the church, right? If you're fellowshipping with the church, there should be some like peer pressure, pushing in a certain direction, right. That's normal. And any group is peer pressure, right? I don't care what group you're in. And the church is no different. There's peer pressure. But the Holy Spirit hopefully is helping to go us along too, It did in the book of Acts. I mean, we see a lot of that, I think, here. Holy Spirit's at work, moving the church forward, breaking new ground. They had to have it. It was very hard to start a church from scratch.
And Paul is going to be able to see this, how that he thought he was doing the Lord's will, but actually he wasn't. Actually, he was pushing against the goad of the word that should have led him to believe in Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah, that should have caused him to be converted. But eventually he is convinced. But anyway, the Lord will not prevent us from doing wrong. But if we're cognizant, there are things that are there that maybe cause us to think, that maybe the Lord will frustrate us in some way if we're trying to do the wrong thing, and we can kind of pull through that and give vent to our lusts and evil desires. But think about it. Look at your life. What's there that the Lord is trying to lead you in the right way or push you in the right way? Anyway, I've come to appreciate those moments as time goes by. Sometimes, the Lord promises that we're not tempted above that which we're able to bear, but with the temptation. There's no new temptation. Sometimes we can say, well, I've met that temptation before. That's the same old thing Satan's trying to get me to do. With the temptation comes a way of escape. Maybe there's something that happens that is just a reminder to us. We ought not to go down that path. We ought not to think in that path. And anyway, then I asked, who are you, Lord? I'm Jesus, whom you are persecuting. The Lord replied, now get up and stand on your feet. I've appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen of me and what I will show you. There's the concept of the witness that he mentioned before in 22nd chapter. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. There's a kind of a explicit promise of protection. Not that he's going to live forever. I'm sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So, kind of a more complete recital of that early communication from Jesus. So, forgiveness and a place among those who are sanctified. What do they need to have forgiveness? They need to know Jesus. It takes a preacher to do it. Paul's got to be that preacher.
It's interesting that Jesus considered Paul to be such an important, that he needed him to be this messenger, that he makes a direct intervention in Paul's or Saul's conversion, where you don't see that with other people. It's usually some human person coming and preaching or telling it, but Jesus here feels that it's necessary to directly confront Paul and change him, because he really needs him to be this messenger.
Did Paul have a choice in the matter?
Yes.
Yeah.
When he was struck blind,
yeah,
he was taken, control of his life was taken from him temporarily, and that's what humbled him. So it wasn't very hard for him to go against Jesus.
I don't know what would have happened. I mean, we can speculate, but we don't know. What would have happened if Paul had said, I'm still going to get those Christians? I don't know if he'd have got his sight back. Maybe, it would have healed, or we don't know. I think what we do know is if Paul had not accommodated himself to the Lord's will, the Lord would have accomplished his objectives in some other way. And Paul's soul would have been lost, but
we want another person.
Yeah, somehow the Lord's will is going to be done, but we need to cooperate with it. So yeah, that's could have continued persecution. Anyway, where are we?
I think it's quarter two, so.
Okay. Well, let's hold up there in the middle of this chapter, if that's okay. And we'll take it up in verse 19 of chapter 26 and continue talking about Agrippa and discussing Paul's sermon to a king and what's the result of that. So thanks for joining us electronically. Thanks for being in the room here with me. We'll try it again, and we'll probably get more used to it. It still feels funny to have a screen in front of my face.
Yeah. get used to it, that's all.
But we'll sing a song. We've been doing that for months and months. And so we'll have Matt lead us in the song.
Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Goodness of the Lord, and of salvation, purchase of God, Lord of your Spirit, wash me in His blood. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior, Lord and Lord. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior, Lord and Lord. Perfect salvation, Lord is in mine. Visions of rapture, powers of my side. Angels descending, bring my heart. Echoes of mercy, whispers of love. This is my story, this is my song. Praising my Savior, Lord and Lord. This is my story, this is my song. Praising my Savior, Lord and Lord. Perfect salvation, I am my Savior, and I am watching and waiting, looking above. Pilgrim in His goodness, lost in His love. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior, Lord and Lord. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior, Lord and Lord.
Amen.
I didn't even think of closing the doors, did we?
I don't close the mixer.
See everybody? Always turn the mirror off.
Yeah.